I could hear everything, every single word. The beeping of the machines next to me, the hum of the hospital ventilation system above my head, the squeaky left wheel on the nurse's cart rolling past my door every 40 minutes. I had memorized that sound. I had memorized everything about that room, because memorizing things, counting sounds, cataloging smells, focusing on anything real was the only thing keeping me from losing my mind. I could not move. I could not speak. I could not open my eyes, but I was there. I was completely, terrifyingly, 100% there, trapped inside my own body like a prisoner behind glass, and the world kept moving without me, talking around me, making decisions about me like I was already gone. And then he walked in. I heard his cologne before I heard his footsteps. 12 years of marriage will do that to you. 12 years and your whole nervous system learns a person. The weight of their walk, the specific pitch of their exhale when something is wrong, the way they clear their throat right before they're about to say something they've rehearsed. He cleared his throat, and my blood, even through the IV lines, even through whatever medication was dripping into my veins, ran cold, because behind his footsteps were hers. I didn't know her name yet, not that day, not in that moment, but I knew the way you know things when every other sense has been taken from you and your intuition is the only thing left standing, that the woman who had just walked into my hospital room was not my friend, was not my sister, was not anyone I had ever been introduced to. She was the reason my husband hadn't cried once since I'd been admitted. She was the reason he always left before visiting hours ended, never after. She was the reason that lying broken in a hospital bed, I felt more alone than I had ever had in my entire life. And then he sat down, right next to me, right next to my bed. And he reached over and he took my hand and I felt it. I felt every bit of it. And he said in this low, hushed voice, "She can't hear us. The doctor said there's no cognitive response. She's completely under." And she, this woman, this stranger standing in my hospital room, she let out a breath like she'd been holding it, like my unconsciousness was a relief to her. And that was the moment I made a decision. I was going to listen to every word. I was going to remember every word. And when I got out of that bed, and I promised myself right then, when, not if, they were both going to answer for every single one. My name is Rachel Monroe, and what I'm about to tell you is not a movie. It's not a podcast episode someone invented for clicks. It is my life. It is the story of the 12 months that broke me open and rebuilt me into someone I barely recognize, but someone I am deeply, fiercely proud of. So sit down, get comfortable, because this is going to take a while, and not a single second of it is going to be wasted. Let me tell you about the life I was living before that hospital room. I grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina, the middle child of 3 girls raised by a woman named Carol who worked double shifts at a textile facility and still somehow made homemade biscuits every Sunday morning. My daddy was in the picture until I was 9, and then he wasn't. And I know now that losing him the way I did shaped everything, every relationship, every choice, every blind spot I carried into my adult life. I was the kind of girl who studied hard because she had something to prove. Went to UNC Charlotte on a partial scholarship, majored in marketing, minored in graphic design, graduated into a recession, took a job at a mid-sized branding firm downtown, worked my way up from junior coordinator to creative director in 8 years. I was proud of that. I am proud of that. I met Daniel Monroe at a rooftop fundraiser in uptown Charlotte. November. He was wearing a gray suit and holding a glass of red wine and laughing at something a colleague had said, and when he turned and caught me looking, he didn't look away. He just smiled, slow and deliberate, like he'd been expecting me. He was charming. He was handsome. He was the kind of man who remembered your coffee order after one date and quoted things he'd read and asked you real questions, not small talk questions, but real ones. What do you want your life to look like in 10 years? What's something you've never told anyone? What are you most afraid of? I fell hard, fast, like I'd been waiting for exactly this person and hadn't known it until he showed up. We were engaged 18 months later, married at 29 in a small ceremony on Lake Norman with fairy lights and my grandmother's lace and a 4-piece jazz band playing during dinner. And for a long time, I want to be honest here, for a long time, it was good. Daniel worked in commercial real estate. He built his own firm from the ground up, and watching him do it was something. He was relentless when it came to work, strategic, persuasive. He could walk into a room and command it without ever raising his voice. I admired that about him more than I probably should have. It was a Tuesday night in February, the kind of cold, wet February that North Carolina does every few years, where the temperature drops fast and the rain turns to ice before anyone's ready for it. I had been at work late. We were in the middle of a major rebranding pitch for a healthcare client, and I had stayed until nearly 9 finishing the presentation deck. I called Daniel on the way to my car. It went to voicemail. I didn't think anything of it. He was probably watching basketball. I got on I-485, and the roads were wet but manageable, and I had the heat up and the radio low, and I was running through the presentation in my head. Slide 12 needed to be repositioned. The color palette on slide 17 was slightly off. I needed to... The car came from the left lane. That's all I remember. That split-second perception of headlights where headlights should not be. My hands jerking the wheel, and then nothing. They told me later, Daniel told me, my mother told me, and eventually Dr. Patricia Hughes, my neurologist, told me in the careful, measured language of someone who has delivered devastating news hundreds of times, that my car had been struck on the driver's side by a pickup truck that had hydroplaned crossing 2 lanes of traffic. The impact spun me into the median barrier. My airbags deployed. A guardrail came through the lower portion of my door. I was in surgery within 40 minutes of the crash. Fractured pelvis, 3 broken ribs, a lacerated spleen, a moderate traumatic brain injury. That was the phrase they used, moderate, though I would later learn there is nothing moderate about what a brain injury does to a person. They put me into a medically induced coma for the first 72 hours to reduce the swelling and give my brain a chance to stabilize. And then something unexpected happened. The swelling reduced, the scans improved. Medically, neurologically, things began to move in the right direction. Dr. Hughes and her team began the process of bringing me back up, reducing the sedation, monitoring my responses, waiting for the moment when I would break the surface and open my eyes. And here is where my story takes a turn that no doctor predicted. I came back faster than they expected. I don't mean I opened my eyes and sat up and asked for water. I mean that somewhere on the second day of reduced sedation, the lights inside me came back on. I could process sound. I could feel. I could, in a distant, murky way, think. But I couldn't move. The neurological pathways were still rerouting. My body was still catching up. It's something that happens sometimes with TBI patients. The brain wakes up before the motor system does. A disconnect, a gap. I was in the room, but I couldn't knock on the door. Dr. Hughes knew I was showing increased brain activity. She noted it in my chart. She told Daniel there was reason for cautious optimism, that I might be responsive sooner than they'd anticipated, that they were monitoring closely. She told him to be careful what he said around me. He didn't listen. The first time she came, it was day 4. I know it was day 4 because I had been counting the nurses' shifts like calendar pages. Day 1 in the ICU, the sounds were chaos, constant. Alarms and voices and the crash cart rolling past twice. Day 2, they moved me to a private room. Day 3, Daniel came alone, sat with me for 20 minutes, said my name twice, then left. 12 years of marriage and he stayed 20 minutes. Day 4, they came together. Her name, I learned this during that first visit, was Vanessa. He said it twice when he thought he was whispering, though to me, in that silence, every sound was amplified. "Vanessa, we don't have long. Vanessa, come sit down." She was nervous. I could hear it in the way she breathed, shallow, quick, like someone who shouldn't be somewhere but can't stop themselves from being there anyway. And he was, and this is the part that still gets me, that still rises up in my chest when I think about it. He was calm. He was calm in a way he almost never was in our daily life. The version of Daniel that existed in that room with her was loose, unburdened, comfortable. That was the version of himself he saved for her. He started slowly, small things first. He talked about how the hospital staff had been asking him questions for the insurance claim. He talked about how he had called my mother and that she was flying in from Greensboro the next day and he needed Vanessa to make herself scarce. Practical things, administrative things. And then Vanessa said, and I will hear this sentence in my bones for the rest of my life. She said, "Daniel, how long are we going to keep doing this? How long are we going to keep pretending?" The room went so quiet I could hear the IV drip. And he said, I know, I'm handling it." Handling it? Like I was a loose end? Like I was a situation to be managed? Like the woman in the bed, the woman he had vowed to love and protect, was an inconvenience in the story of his real life. I want to tell you that I reacted, that my monitor spiked, that some part of me physically registered the devastation of that moment. But I didn't. I stayed perfectly still, and I listened. What came out over the next 40 minutes, because they stayed for 40 minutes that first day, was 3 years of a secret delivered like a confession to a priest. 3 years. Vanessa was not some new distraction. This was not a midlife impulse or a moment of weakness. This had been 3 structured years of a parallel life that Daniel Monroe had been running alongside mine with a precision and intentionality that still takes my breath away when I think about it. He had met her at a real estate conference in Atlanta. She was a mortgage broker, smart, independent, apparently incredibly good at her job. He had pursued her, not the other way around. He had been the one who first said, "I'm not happy at home." He had been the one who escalated from texts to calls to hotel rooms in cities close enough to drive to and far enough that no one would ask questions. He told her things that night, sitting next to me, holding my hand while he talked to her, that he had never once said to me. That he felt trapped, that the miscarriages had broken something in him that he never figured out how to repair, that he had thrown himself into work and into her because he didn't know how to talk to me anymore. And I lay there, taking it all in. Taking it in and burning it into the part of my memory that nothing, no brain injury, no medication, no passage of time was ever going to reach. But here's the thing. Here is the thing that transformed this story from a tragedy into something else entirely. My phone was in the room. It had survived the crash, scratched and cracked but functional. And one of the nurses, God bless her, a night shift nurse named Darlene, who had tucked it under my pillow so it would be there when I woke up, had placed it right there, under my left hand. And on day 3, during a window when I was alone and a fraction of my motor function had begun to quietly, tentatively return, I had felt it there, and I had moved my thumb. Just my thumb. Just barely, just enough. I had opened the voice memo app, muscle memory from years of recording ideas for work, and I had pressed record. It was already recording when they walked in on day 4. It recorded everything. Let me tell you what the next 9 days sounded like, because they came back. That's the part I don't think either of them ever considered, that she would keep coming, that he would keep bringing her, that the room they believed was sealed by my unconsciousness would become for them the one place in their lives where they could speak freely. I became their confessional, and I recorded every session. By day 6, I had learned that Daniel had taken out a second life insurance policy on me 14 months earlier, $2 million. He framed it to me at the time as financial planning. We'd been meaning to update our policies anyway, he'd said. It was just responsible adulting. I had signed the paperwork at the kitchen table and never thought about it again. On day 6, I learned what he'd been thinking when he handed me that pen. Vanessa asked him directly. I think even she had a threshold. She asked him, "Daniel, the policy, you're not thinking about..." And she didn't finish the sentence. She couldn't finish the sentence. And he was quiet for a long time. And then he said, "No, of course not. I'm not that person." But the way he said it, the pause before it, the rehearsed quality of the denial, told me everything I needed to know. He had thought about it. Whether he had moved beyond thinking, I didn't know, and I wasn't willing to wait to find out. On day 7, I learned that Vanessa knew about our IVF attempts. He had told her, intimately, in detail. He had shared the most private grief of our marriage with another woman while pretending to grieve alongside me at home. I had held his hand in that doctor's office when they told us the last round hadn't worked, and he had gone home that same night and texted her about it. On day 8, I heard him tell her that he had already been consulting with a divorce attorney, months before the accident. He had been building a case, documenting finances, having preliminary conversations, trying to understand what a split would look like. He wasn't planning to wait for me to recover. He had been planning to file. And on day 9, I heard the thing that changed my recovery from gradual to urgent. He told her he was going to let the doctors know he wanted to discuss quality of life decisions. If I had not already been recording, I would have started right then. My mother, Carol, arrived on day 4. I heard her before I heard anyone. Her voice is the one sound in the world my nervous system has never been able to be neutral about. She walked into that room and she said, "Rachel, baby, Mama's here." And something in me surged upward toward her like a drowning woman reaching for light. She noticed things Daniel didn't. Mothers do. She noticed that my fingers seemed to curl slightly when she spoke. She told the nurses. The nurses told Dr. Hughes. Dr. Hughes ran more assessments, and by day 7, she had quietly escalated her documentation of my responsiveness. She was cautious. She didn't want to alarm anyone or give false hope, but she told my mother privately that she believed I was closer to the surface than the general assessment suggested. My mother never left after that. She slept in the chair next to my bed. She talked to me constantly about home, about my sisters, about the biscuit she was going to make me the second I was up and could chew solid food. She read me articles from Southern Living magazine because she knew I'd always had a complicated relationship with it. And every time she was in the room, I worked. Silently, invisibly, I worked. trying to reconnect the signals, trying to find the pathways back to my body. It is the hardest thing I have ever done in my life, and I have done hard things. I pressed every internal muscle I had against the wall of my own stillness, and I pushed. On day 11, I opened my eyes. Not all the way, not dramatically. A flutter, barely a flutter, but Dr. Hughes was in the room doing rounds, and she saw it. And the next 4 hours were a controlled flurry of activity and assessments, and my mother crying in the hallway, and at one point laughing and crying simultaneously in the way that only pure relief can produce in a person. Daniel was called. He arrived 45 minutes later. He stood at the foot of my bed and looked at me, at my barely open eyes, at whatever expression was on my face, and I watched something move through him. I couldn't tell you exactly what it was. Complicated things live in complicated men. But I saw it, and I remembered it, and I added it to the archive. I was not able to speak clearly for another 4 days. My voice came back in fragments, a sound, then a syllable, then a cracked whisper that took enormous effort and sounded nothing like me. But my mind had never left. And my phone, retrieved carefully by my mother when I finally managed to communicate its importance with a look and a tremble of my hand toward the pillow, my phone had 41 hours of recordings on it. I want to be careful here about how I tell this part, because there's a version of this story where the injured woman, full of righteous anger, confronts her husband in a dramatic scene, and it all comes spilling out in one cathartic explosion. And I understand why that version is satisfying. I understand the appeal of the moment where the villain gets caught and the truth is spoken loudly and everyone knows. But that is not what I did. What I did was smarter and colder and more deliberate than anything I have ever done in my professional or personal life. I said nothing. I recovered, slowly, visibly, the way someone who had simply been unconscious would recover. I was warm and grateful and appropriately fragile. I thanked the nurses. I held Daniel's hand when he visited. I answered the doctor's questions. I smiled at my mother. I ate the hospital jello and made a face about it and let everyone laugh. And the whole time, the recording sat on my phone, backed up 3 times to 3 separate cloud accounts that Daniel did not know existed, copies sent to an email address he had never seen on a server in a state we had never visited. I had one phone call I needed to make before anything else, and I made it on day 16, during a window when my mother had stepped out for coffee and Daniel had not yet arrived for his daily visit. I called a woman named Sandra Okafor. Sandra is one of the top family law attorneys in Charlotte. I had known about her professionally for years. She had represented the wife in a high-profile real estate divorce case that had made the local business press. And the moment I had learned about the insurance policy and the divorce attorney consultations, her name had risen to the front of my mind like something I'd always known I'd need. I kept my voice low and steady, and I told her, I have been in a medically induced coma. I have recordings of my husband confessing to a years-long affair. I have reason to believe he may have been contemplating harm to me. I need you. She said, don't say another word. I'll be there tomorrow. Sandra came dressed like she was visiting a friend, casual, no briefcase, nothing that would signal what she was. She sat with me for 2 hours while Daniel was at the office. I transferred the audio files to her. I told her everything I remembered. She listened with a stillness I recognized, the stillness of someone who is furious on your behalf, but has learned to keep that fuel clean and directed. When she left, she squeezed my hand and said, Rachel, I need you to understand something. You have not just grounds for divorce, you have grounds for criminal investigation. The insurance policy timing, the recorded statements, the consultation with a divorce attorney before the accident, we are going to build something that he cannot dismantle. I nodded. I did not cry. I think I had already cried everything I had to cry in that hospital room when no one could see me do it. I was discharged after 23 days. Coming home to that Ballantine house was surreal in a way I didn't anticipate. Everything was exactly as I had left it and completely different from how I now understood it to be. The quartz countertops I had picked out tile by tile. Chester, the dog, who pressed himself against my legs and wouldn't leave my side from the moment I walked through the door. The framed photos on the hallway wall, our wedding, the trip to Napa, Christmas 2 years ago, that I now looked at the way you look at a stage set when the show is over. Daniel was attentive, performatively attentive. He helped me in and out of chairs, brought me my medications on schedule, asked 3 times a day how I was feeling. He was playing a role, and I recognized it because I was playing one too. We were 2 people in a house performing a marriage, both knowing it was theater, neither willing to be the first to step off stage. My mother stayed for 6 weeks. I will never be able to repay her for those 6 weeks. She was my anchor. She cooked and fussed and asked me pointed questions with her eyes. Are you okay? Are you sure? Do you need me to do something? And I would hold her gaze a half-second longer than necessary, and she would understand that I needed her to stay close but let me work. She never asked me directly what I knew. I think she was afraid that if I said it out loud, she wouldn't be able to compose herself, and she knew I needed her composed. During those weeks at home, Sandra and her team were working. Quietly and methodically and with extraordinary precision, they were building a case. They subpoenaed phone records, they pulled financial documents, they located the divorce attorney Daniel had consulted, who was legally obligated to disclose the consultation once proceedings were initiated. They found 3 hotel charges from the past 2 years, 2 in Raleigh and 1 in Asheville, booked under Daniel's business account in ways that were artful but not invisible to a forensic accountant. They built the architecture of 12 years of marriage, and then they found every crack Daniel had quietly knocked into the foundation. And I healed. Physically, I healed. Slowly and painfully, and with twice-weekly sessions with a physical therapist named Marcus, who was both exceptionally skilled and completely unafraid to push me, and a neurologist who adjusted my medications 3 times before we found the right balance, and a therapist named Dr. Yolanda James, who I started seeing in week 3 and who I still see today, and who was one of the most important people in my life. I healed, and I waited. I chose a Saturday morning. 6 weeks after I came home, my mother had returned to Greensboro the previous weekend with my careful assurance that I was strong enough, that I had support, that I would call her if I needed anything. Chester was in the backyard. The house was quiet. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee and his laptop, responding to emails, doing what Daniel Monroe did on a Saturday morning, while his wife moved slowly through the kitchen making tea. I sat down across from him. He looked up, smiled the polished, practiced smile he had been giving me for 6 weeks. "How are you feeling?" I said, "I need you to listen to something." Something shifted in his face, small, barely perceptible, but I knew his face better than any other face in the world. I put my phone on the table between us, and I pressed play. "Vanessa, we don't have long." His voice coming out of that speaker in his own kitchen was something I don't have language adequate enough to describe. It was like watching a man come face to face with his own ghost. He went absolutely still. I let it play for 90 seconds. 90 seconds of his voice, her voice, the confessions, the calculations, the intimacy of two people who believed they were alone. 90 seconds, and then I stopped it. He said my name. I said, "My attorney's name is Sandra Okafor. You have 72 hours to retain counsel. The papers have already been prepared." He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and I watched the man I had loved for 12 years cycle through every response he had: denial, justification, apology, deflection, and find that every single door was already locked. Because here is the thing about a woman who was forced to lie still and listen while the person she trusted most dismantled her world. She has had a long time to prepare for every single word he might say. I had answers for all of it. "Rachel, I can explain. You already did. I was there. The recording is backed up in 6 locations. Sandra has copies. My mother has a copy. There is nothing you can do." "I didn't mean any of it. You were just telling your girlfriend that you had consulted a divorce attorney. You were just discussing a $2 million insurance policy while sitting next to my hospital bed. You were just..." I stopped myself because I had promised myself I would not do this out of heat. I had promised myself I would stay cold and clean and intentional. "Daniel," I said, "I'm not interested in your explanations. I'm not interested in your apologies. I am interested in a clean, fair, and complete separation of everything we built together. You will not fight me on this, and you will understand why when Sandra's team shows you everything they have found." He started to cry. And I am not ashamed to say this, felt nothing. Not cruelty, not satisfaction, not relief, nothing. Because the grief of what we had been, what I had believed we were, what I had wanted us to be, all of that had already happened. It had happened in that hospital room over 9 days of recorded confessions. I had already grieved him. I had already mourned the marriage. I was sitting across from him in this kitchen, not as a wife, but as a woman who was done. He moved out 2 weeks later. The divorce took 8 months. Daniel did not fight it. I think in the end, when Sandra laid out the full scope of what they had, the recordings, the financial documentation, the insurance policy timeline, the pre-crash consultations with his own attorney, even Daniel, who was at his core a calculating person, could do the math. He was looking at potential criminal exposure. The insurance policy in and of itself is not a crime, but the timing, combined with the recorded statements that Sandra's team argued were consistent with premeditating financial harm, created a picture that no defense attorney was going to enjoy presenting. He settled. I kept the house. I kept Chester. I received a settlement that Sandra called with a quiet, professional satisfaction I deeply appreciated, appropriate to the circumstances. I won't give you the number, but it was appropriate. Vanessa Calloway, I never contacted. I thought about it. There were nights in those early months when I lay in the house in Ballantyne, unable to sleep, turning over what I would say to her if I had the chance. But eventually I arrived at this. She is not my work. She is not my wound to heal or my fight to have. She knew he was married. She made her choices. What happens between her and her own conscience is between her and her own conscience. Daniel moved to Raleigh. I heard through mutual acquaintances, and there is always an ecosystem of mutual acquaintances, that the relationship with Vanessa ended within a year of the divorce. I can't say I was surprised. A man who builds a parallel life is usually less interested in the person than in the act of building it. When the act loses its secrecy, it often loses its appeal. I do not wish him well. I also do not wish him harm. I am working toward indifference, and some days I achieve it. I want to talk about what this did to me. For the first year after the divorce, I'm going to be honest, not okay. I did the things I was supposed to do. I went to therapy. I went to physical therapy. I went back to work. I walked Chester every morning. I called my mother. I had dinner with my best friend Diane every Thursday. I did the scaffolding of a functioning life, and I held on to it until the scaffolding started to feel like the building. But underneath, there was damage. Real damage. Not just to my trust, though my trust had been shattered in ways I am still learning to understand, but to my sense of self. Because when you love someone for 12 years and you discover that they were capable of sitting next to your unconscious body and discussing a life insurance policy, you don't just lose the marriage, you lose every version of yourself that trusted that person, every version of yourself that believed the story you were living. You have to rebuild yourself from a level you did not expect to be starting from. I rebuilt. I sold the Ballantyne house 18 months after the divorce. I needed a different kitchen. I needed rooms that didn't have his shape pressed into them. I bought a smaller place in Plaza Midwood, a neighborhood I had always loved, but Daniel had thought was too far from his office. Chester loves the backyard. I love the light. I got a promotion, creative director to VP of brand strategy, that I had been circling for 2 years and finally stopped talking myself out of pursuing. I got it. I am good at my job. And the version of me that came out of that hospital room stopped apologizing for knowing that. I started writing, privately at first, then with the intention of eventually sharing it. This story, telling this story, is part of that process. Not because I want sympathy, though I understand that some of you will feel it, and I receive it gratefully, but because I know there are women out there, and maybe men, and maybe people in situations I can't imagine, who have been lied to by the person who was supposed to be their safest place. And I want them to know that surviving that is possible. Not easy, not linear, not clean, but possible. I want them to know that the part of you that refuses to believe it, the part that lies still in the dark and listens and thinks and plans, that part is not passive. That is not weakness. That is the most powerful thing you have. There will be people who listen to this story and ask why I didn't say something sooner, why I didn't alert a nurse, signal a doctor, find some way to expose what was happening in real time. And here is my answer. I was hurt. I was scared. I was alone inside my own body, and the only tool I had was patience and a voice memo app. I used what I had. That is all any of us can ever do. Use what we have. My name is Rachel Monroe. I survived a car accident that broke 4 bones and rearranged the furniture in my brain. I lay still for 9 days while my husband confessed his betrayal to another woman 3 feet from my head. I recorded 41 hours of it. I built a case. I healed my body. I rebuilt my life. I sleep in a house that is entirely mine, with a dog who loves me unconditionally, in a city I chose for myself, doing work that I am proud of. And some nights, some quiet, still, late Charlotte nights, I think about that hospital room. I think about the beeping machines and the squeaky cartwheel and the feeling of my thumb moving just barely to press record. And I am grateful. Not for what he did, never for what he did, but for what I discovered I was made of in the dark when I thought no one was watching. Because it turns out, I was watching. I was always watching. And I wrote down every word.